Imagine if tomorrow every university library, every museum, every repository of human knowledge suddenly vanished. Every book, every research paper, every archive gone. That's what happened when the Library of Alexandria burned. This is the story of the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. Hey, I'm Michael, and welcome to Hoodie History. Today, I'm exploring a loss so profound that we're still feeling its effects over 1600 years later. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building full of books, it was the ancient world's collective memory, the repository of everything humanity had learned, discovered, and created. And when it was destroyed, we lost knowledge that we've spent centuries trying to recover, and some that we never will. This is the story of how the ancient world's greatest achievement became its greatest tragedy. Let's go back to around 300 BCE to the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Alexander the Great had died young, and his empire had been carved up among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I, had claimed Egypt as his prize. But Ptolemy didn't just want to rule Egypt, he wanted to make his capital, Alexandria, the intellectual center of the world. So Ptolemy came up with an audacious plan. He would build a library that contained every book ever written, not just Greek texts, but works from Egypt, Persia, India, Judea, everywhere. Every play, every philosophical treatise, every mathematical proof, every historical chronicle, every astronomical observation, all human knowledge gathered in one place. It was an impossible dream, and remarkably, they almost achieved it. The Library of Alexandria, or more accurately, the Great Library, because there were actually multiple library buildings in the city, began collecting scrolls with almost religious fervor. The Ptolemies employed agents throughout the Mediterranean world to purchase, copy, or acquire texts by any means necessary. And when I say any means necessary, I mean it. Alexandria had a policy that became legendary. Any ship that docked in the harbour was searched for books. If scrolls were found, they were confiscated and taken to the library. Scribes would make copies, and then, here's the twist, the library kept the originals and sent the copies back to the ship's owners. Imagine that. You arrive in Alexandria with a precious original manuscript of Sophocles, and you leave with a copy made by some scribe you've never met. Your original is now the property of the library. The Ptolemies also sent letters to rulers throughout the known world, asking to borrow books. They promised to return them, and they did return books, just not the originals. The library kept the genuine articles and sent back copies. When Ptolemy III convinced Athens to lend Alexandria the official state copies of the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, Athens demanded a massive deposit to ensure their return, but Ptolemy forfeited the deposit and kept the originals. This aggressive collection built an extraordinary repository. Ancient sources claim the library eventually held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To put that in perspective, each scroll contained one work, like one play, one book of history, one mathematical treatise. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of unique texts. But the Library of Alexandria was more than just a storage facility. It was the world's first research institute, the first true university. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to study there. The Ptolemies provided them with salaries, research grants, and access to knowledge that existed nowhere else on Earth. The greatest minds of the ancient world worked in Alexandria. Euclid developed his geometry there, the same geometry you probably studied in school. Archimedes may have studied there. Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy 1700 years before Columbus, was the library's chief librarian. The library had lecture halls, laboratories, observatories, dining rooms, and gardens. Scholars lived there, debated there, made discoveries there. It was Google, MIT, and the Smithsonian all rolled into one institution. And what did it contain? Everything. Complete copies of plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we've now lost. Detailed histories of Egypt written by Egyptian priests in Greek. Mathematical proofs that we've had to rediscover centuries later. Star charts mapping constellations we've forgotten. Medical texts describing treatments we no longer understand. Poetry, philosophy, engineering, manuals, religious texts from a dozen different traditions. The Library of Alexandria was humanity's hard drive. It stored everything we knew, and then slowly, over centuries, it was destroyed. The thing about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is that there wasn't one dramatic moment when it all burned down. The popular image, a single catastrophic fire consuming the entire library, isn't quite accurate. Instead, the library died slowly, across several centuries, damaged by accident, destroyed by violence, and finally suffocated by the changing intellectual climate of the ancient world. The first major damage came in 48 BCE, and it was an accident. Julius Caesar was in Alexandria, caught up in a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar's forces were outnumbered and besieged near the harbour. To prevent enemy ships from attacking, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The fire spread, it jumped from the ships to the docks to the warehouses along the waterfront. Some of those warehouses contained scrolls, perhaps 40,000 of them, destined for the library or stored temporarily from ships in the harbour. Caesar's fire probably didn't destroy the main library building, but it did destroy a significant portion of Alexandria's book collection. Thousands of texts gone, and this was just the beginning. Over the following centuries, Alexandria declined. The city was caught in the endless power struggles of the late Roman Empire. In 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian besieged Alexandria to put down a revolt. His forces destroyed much of the royal quarter, the section of the city where the main library stood. We don't know exactly how much survived Aurelian's attack, but after that point, ancient sources stopped mentioning the Great Library. The Serapeum, a temple complex that housed a smaller daughter library, became the primary repository of Alexandria's remaining books. But the real threat to Alexandria's knowledge wasn't fire or war, it was ideology. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The new Christian authorities viewed the classical learning preserved in Alexandria with deep suspicion. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, mathematical and astronomical texts that contradicted biblical cosmology, all of this was increasingly seen as pagan heresy. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued a decree banning pagan worship throughout the empire. In Alexandria, Bishop Theophilus seized the opportunity. He led a Christian mob to the Serapeum, destroyed the temple, and burned whatever remained of the daughter library housed there. The scholars of Alexandria watched centuries of accumulated knowledge go up in flames. The great institutions that had preserved human learning for 700 years were now in ruins. But the tradition of scholarship didn't die entirely. It lived on in individual teachers, in private libraries, in those who still believed knowledge was worth pursuing. And that brings us to Hypatia. Hypatia was born around 355 CE into Alexandria's intellectual elite. Her father Theon was a mathematician and astronomer, one of the last scholars working in Alexandria's fading academic tradition. He educated his daughter in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, an extraordinary education for anyone in the 4th century, let alone a woman. Hypatia didn't just learn, she surpassed her teachers. By her 30s, she was the leading intellectual in Alexandria, teaching mathematics and Neoplatonic philosophy to students who came from across the Mediterranean to study with her. She wrote commentaries on mathematical works, improved astronomical instruments, and may have contributed to advances in algebra and geometry. She was, by all accounts, a brilliant teacher. Her students revered her. They described her lectures as electrifying, her ability to explain complex ideas as unmatched. With the Serapeum destroyed, she taught in her home and in public spaces, drawing crowds of students eager to hear her speak. And crucially, Hypatia was a woman in a position of intellectual authority in a city where women were expected to be silent and subordinate. She wore the robes of a philosopher, traditionally male attire, she walked through the city unchaperoned, she taught men, and she wielded influence in Alexandria's political life, advising the city's Roman prefect, Orestes. In an Alexandria dominated by increasingly fundamentalist Christian bishops, Hypatia represented everything they opposed: pagan learning, female autonomy, classical philosophy, and secular political power. The Bishop of Alexandria at this time was Cyril, nephew of Theophilus, the man who destroyed the Serapeum. Cyril would later be declared a saint by the Christian Church, but in his own time he was known for his violent suppression of Jews, pagans, and anyone who challenged his authority. Cyril and Orestes, the prefect whom Hypatia advised, were locked in a bitter power struggle over who really controlled Alexandria. Cyril commanded the loyalty of Alexandria's Christian population. Orestes had the backing of the city's remaining pagan and Jewish communities, and he relied heavily on Hypatia's counsel. To Cyril's followers, Hypatia became a symbol of pagan resistance to Christian dominance. Rumors spread that she was using witchcraft and pagan magic to influence Orestes, that she was preventing Christians from achieving power, that she was an obstacle to God's will. In March 415 CE, during the season of Lent, Hypatia was traveling through Alexandria in her chariot. A mob of Christian zealots, possibly monks loyal to Bishop Cyril, pulled her from the chariot. What happened next is documented by multiple ancient sources, and it's horrifying. The mob dragged Hypatia to a church called the Caesareum. They stripped her naked, then they murdered her. Accounts say they scraped the flesh from her bones using roof tiles or oyster shells, though the exact details vary. They tore her body to pieces and burned the remains. Hypatia was around 60 years old. She was arguably the last great scholar of Alexandria, the last living connection to the city's intellectual golden age. The great library buildings were already gone, destroyed decades earlier. Hypatia herself was the library now, a walking repository of knowledge, the last link to a tradition that had spanned 7 centuries. And she was killed by a mob who saw her knowledge, her teaching, and her influence as threats to their religious dominance. Her murder sent shockwaves through what remained of Alexandria's academic community. Scholars fled the city. The tradition of open philosophical inquiry that had defined Alexandria for 700 years came to an end. The Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense, had already been destroyed when the Serapeum burned in 391. But it truly died with Hypatia in 415, when the last person who embodied that tradition was murdered in the streets. So what did we lose when Alexandria burned? The honest answer is we don't know, and that's what makes it so tragic. We know we lost plays. The ancient Greeks produced thousands of theatrical works. We have complete copies of only 44 plays, 33 tragedies, and 11 comedies. Ancient sources reference hundreds more that we know existed but have vanished completely. We lost histories. Egyptian priests wrote comprehensive histories of their civilization in Greek, making thousands of years of Egyptian knowledge accessible to the classical world, and almost all of it is gone. We lost mathematical and scientific works. Archimedes wrote treatises that we only know about through later references. We lost astronomical observations accumulated over centuries. We lost engineering manuals, architectural treatises, and medical texts. We lost poems, novels, philosophical dialogues, and religious texts from traditions that no longer exist. Some of this knowledge has been painfully reconstructed. Renaissance scholars spent centuries rediscovering mathematical principles that had been proven in Alexandria and then lost. Modern medicine has validated some ancient treatments mentioned in fragmentary sources. But some knowledge is gone forever. We'll never read the lost plays of Sophocles. We'll never know what Egyptian priests wrote about their own history. We'll never see the mathematical proofs that burned. And the devastating reality is that we don't even know what we're missing. The texts we know about from references in other sources, those are just the ones that happen to be mentioned somewhere that survived. How many works existed that we have no record of at all? What cures for diseases burned in Alexandria? What philosophical insights? What understanding of the natural world? What poetry that could rival Homer? We'll never know. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is often framed as a story about the conflict between reason and faith, between knowledge and ignorance. And there's truth to that. The Serapeum's destruction and Hypatia's murder were absolutely motivated by religious extremism, but it's also a story about fragility. For centuries, Alexandria preserved human knowledge. The library survived wars, political upheavals, and economic crises, but in the end, it couldn't survive a fundamental change in what society valued. When Alexandria's rulers valued knowledge for its own sake, the library flourished. When they valued religious orthodoxy more than philosophical inquiry, the library died. The tragedy of Alexandria isn't just what was lost, it's that it was lost unnecessarily. Those scrolls didn't have to burn, Hypatia didn't have to die, the tradition of scholarship could have continued. But it didn't, and we're still living with the consequences. We've rebuilt a lot of what was lost. The Renaissance recovered some texts, modern science has rediscovered many principles, and we've made new discoveries that probably surpass what Alexandria knew. But we'll never recover it all, and Alexandria stands as a permanent reminder that progress isn't inevitable. Knowledge, once lost, can stay lost forever. Civilization can go backwards, and humanity can forget what it once knew. So what do you think? Could something like Alexandria happen today? Could we lose our accumulated knowledge if we're not careful to preserve it? And what responsibility do we have to protect not just physical libraries, but the idea that knowledge itself is worth preserving, even when it challenges our beliefs? Let me know in the comments what you think about the Library of Alexandria and what its destruction should teach us about protecting knowledge today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's greatest tragedies, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. If you want to keep up with Hoodie history between episodes, come and find me on Instagram or TikTok. You can find me at Hoodie History on both. I publish short history videos over there regularly. And if you want more history delivered straight to your inbox, stories, reflections, the occasional deep dive rabbit hole, the Hoodie History newsletter is the place for it. You'll find the sign up link in the episode description. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, remember that the preservation of knowledge is never guaranteed. It requires constant effort and constant vigilance.